April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began when Nazi forces attempted to clear out the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, Poland, and send the ghetto residents to concentration camps. The ghetto refused to surrender and bravely fought until May 16, 1943. 13,000 Jews died during the uprising. About half of them were burned alive or suffocated. The remaining Jews were sent to concentration camps. We remember all whose lives were lost during the Holocaust. We remember these victims who were robbed of their lives. We light a candle so they will not be robbed also of their deaths. It is my pleasure to introduce Lex Silbiger. As you listen and watch his talk, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions. Questions will go to Lana, who will forward them to Lex. Lex, we look forward to hearing your remarks today.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. And welcome everybody to my home. It feels strange to be talking to you today about another time in which the familiar and comfortable world changed almost overnight into a place full of danger, fear, and uncertainty. Eventually, some kind of normalcy returned, but many did not survive that terrible time. Now, I'm going to turn on a slide presentation. This may take me just a minute, so everybody be patient. Oh, if all went well, you should see now the opening slide with the title of the talk. Today, on Yom HaShoah, we remember and mourn the 6 million European Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. Another 3 million managed to survive, even if the course of their lives was irrevocably changed. But how did they survive? There must be 3 million stories to answer this question. My story is one of those. It's the tale of an amazing adventure of a young boy, an adventure that lasted over a year, that took him to faraway places, and that was rather scary. But let me begin at the beginning. I was born in the Netherlands in 1935 and grew up in the city of The Hague. Here is a picture of my family. My parents celebrating a wedding anniversary, my older brother, Herman, whom I knew as Hermie, and here am I. A few days before my 5th birthday, the Germans invaded my country. I well remember the morning of the invasion. I was awakened by loud banging noises. First, I thought my brother was, whose room was right above mine, was for some reason jumping up and down, but I realized that was not what it was, and I went to the window to see what was going on. Against the bright blue spring sky, I saw plumes of smoke everywhere. The German army was making a surprise assault on The Hague, which was the seat of the Dutch government, and they hoped to capture its leaders. Fortunately, the Queen and her cabinet managed to get away and set up a government in exile in London, fortunate as it would turn out for my family. A few days later, in the middle of my 5th birthday party, sirens went off signaling an air raid, and we had to rush to the improvised shelter in our basement while donning gas masks. An attack from the air, during which at any moment a bomb may explode your entire world, is a frightening experience. an experience to which civilian populations in many parts of the world continue to be subjected. The next day, Holland capitulated, its small army being no match for the powerful German war machine, and soon their troops marched through our streets. The German occupation came as a shock. The Netherlands had remained neutral during the First World War, and in fact had not seen foreign armies on its soil since the time of Napoleon. Its native population included some 120,000 Jews, and another 20,000 had fled there from Germany to escape the anti-Semitic persecutions. Among them, the Anne Frank family. For the Jews, the sudden German presence in Holland was the cause of much anxiety. At first, the life of Jews under the occupation, while unpleasant, did not appear life-threatening. This lulled many people into a false sense of security. Maybe it was not going to be so bad after all. Maybe it was just a matter of sitting things out until after a few months, the British and American forces would surely come and kick the Germans out. That kind of optimism, or rather wishful thinking, may have a familiar ring today. To be sure, there were stories of the brutal mistreatment of Jews in Eastern Europe, but people could not imagine that happening in Holland. Jews had lived in Holland for many centuries. They had made important contributions to the Dutch economy and Dutch culture and had become a valued part of the population. The Dutch people would never stand for their fellow citizens being mistreated in this manner. And no one could even begin to conceive the eventual goal of the Nazis, to extinguish the life of every Jew in the Netherlands. Now, to achieve this goal, the Germans first had to identify the Jews, not always easy due to the high degree of Jewish assimilation in Holland. They began by requiring everyone in Holland to register and state their religion, which seemed innocent enough. Jews received a big fat J on their ID card. If you're stopped in the street without your ID, you are in trouble. After that, the Germans introduced a series of increasingly restrictive measures on Jewish social lives. Jews, a new one almost every week. Jews were not permitted to go to the movies, theaters, concerts, libraries, restaurants, cafes, sport arenas, beaches, swimming pool, and public parks. Everywhere you saw these signs, and I remember that well. For Joden verboden, rhymes in Dutch, it means no Jews allowed. The first restriction to affect me personally was that Jewish children were banned from public education. When at 6, I was ready to start school, I could not go to the neighborhood school where all my non-Jewish friends, where all my new Jewish friends went. We need to go back a little here. As Sharon warned me, there'll probably be a few glitches, and this was one of them. Okay, you got a little preview of things to come. When at 6 I was ready to start school, I could not go to the neighborhood school where all my non-Jewish friends were. And instead, I had to take a streetcar by myself to the other end of town, to a Jewish private school where I knew no one. However, at that age, you make new friends fast enough. Further decrees included restrictions on Jewish movement. Jews could no longer own cars or even bicycles. They were banned from trains and eventually from all public transportation. The last major decree was that every Jew, children included, had to wear a cloth yellow star sewn on their clothes at the location of their hearts. Now, all these measures aimed to isolate the Jews from the rest of the population and humiliate them, to make them appear different and inferior, almost subhuman. This method, by the way, was consciously modeled on the American Jim Crow laws. The Nazis hoped thus to minimize Dutch resistance by moving to the final phase of their plan, which was initiated in the summer of 1942 and largely completed by the next spring, when Holland could be declared Judenrein, cleansed of Jews. The extermination took place not in Holland itself, but in regions of East Europe where there always existed less solidarity with the Jewish population. The Dutch Jews were deported there under the pretext that they were merely being transported to work camps. They were first taken to Westerbork, a holding camp in the east of the country. Here they are waiting to get on the train to go there. And here you see them in the camp. From Westerbork, each week, a train transported 1,000 Jews to Auschwitz, a two-way day's journey during which they were squeezed in a padlocked cattle car without facilities. Upon their arrival, they were sent either straight to the gas chambers or chosen to be worked to death in slave labor or be subjected to the unspeakable horrors of medical experiments. The statistics are dismal. Of approximately 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands, 120,000 were deported, and of those, only 5,000 returned from the camps. That means that fewer than 1 out of 5 Jews survived, considerably fewer than the 1 out of 3 for Europe as a whole. One of several reasons is that Holland is a small but very densely populated country with no mountains and hardly any forests to hide in. Some 16,000 Jews survived by hiding behind walls like Anne Frank and her family, in closets, under floorboards, on farms, in barns, and all kinds of other places. This was not only uncomfortable, but also risky. Many of the underdivers, as they were called in Holland, were betrayed. If today you're beginning to feel claustrophobic, having to stay in your home to hide from the virus, think of how much better off you are than those underdivers. A much smaller number of Jews, fewer than 3,000, or approximately 1 out of 50, survived by escaping entirely from the Nazi-controlled territories, a path possibly more dangerous and surely more difficult than going into hiding. Among those were the members of my family. Early in 1942, my parents began to realize that in spite of the Germans' effort to hide their ultimate intentions, things looked bad for the Jews in Holland. It would be best to try to leave, no matter how difficult or dangerous. Secretly, they began preparing for their escape, not telling their closest friends or family, not even their children, of their plans. But they also decided that they must take their young children along, even if that would greatly complicate their flights. Some people attempted a similar escape, but they thought it would be safer for everyone if they left their children hidden with a Christian family. Even if the children were discovered, they thought, the Germans were not likely to harm little kids. When the parents returned after the war, they often discovered their children had been betrayed and were gone. This happened to some good friends of my parents. Sometimes the opposite happened. The children survived, but as orphans, because the parents were caught trying to escape. My brother and I were fortunate that their parents decided they must keep their family together at all costs. In the early morning of 13 April 1942, my mother woke me up and told me to hurry and get ready for a little trip to the country. I was taken by surprise because I had not been told anything about this beforehand. I became even more surprised when we did not return home that evening. but we continued on to Antwerp in Belgium. Once we arrived there, I learned that we would not be going back home until the Germans were gone from Holland. I was suddenly, and without preparation, cut off from all my friends, my toys, my books, and everything else I owned except for a few clothes. I was also separated from my previous identity, since I acquired a new family name, a new nationality, and a new religion, although all that probably mattered less to me. On the continuation of our journey, we hoped to pass as Christian tourists from Belgium, and I was warned not to tell anyone my real family name or to mention that I was Jewish, because that could endanger the whole family. My parents did not have a clear idea where we would ultimately go. They had started heading south from The Hague to Belgium because that was the only feasible escape route. To the east lay Germany itself, and north and west was the sea, with a heavily patrolled coastline, part of the so-called Atlantic Wall. They hoped eventually to reach some territory not under German rule, like perhaps Switzerland, Spain, or Portugal, which would require crossing several borders illegally. There was no internet or even a travel agent to help map out their journey. Instead, they had to rely on various contacts provided by the underground resistance, with which my father had had connections back in Holland. These contacts were not necessarily trustworthy, sometimes demanded payment for their services, and occasionally obtained additional payments by betraying you to the Gestapo, the German police. But my folks had no alternative. We headed south to France, where we changed our name again, and I was given even stricter rules. I was not to speak in public, since the only language I knew at the time was Dutch, and that might betray us. I was warned not to make friends with anyone my age, and during the entire journey, which lasted almost a year, I would not be attending school. When we reached Paris, my parents learned that their local contact had just been arrested, and we were stuck. We had to remain in Paris for 6 weeks while my parents searched for someone else to help us move on. After they finally succeeded finding such a person, we proceeded towards the most difficult part of our journey, the crossing of the demarcation line. This was the border between the northern occupied part of France and the southern zone, which at the time was still nominally independent, although ruled by a German-installed puppet government headquartered in Vichy. While the earlier borders we had crossed were guarded comparatively lightly, since the Germans controlled both sides, this boundary, separated occupied from unoccupied France, was under heavy guard and required the services of an experienced passeur, as they were called, or coyote. Our crossing was in fact not unlike that of illegal immigrants at the US-Mexican border, involved running through fields in sparsely populated areas, crawling under barbed wire fences, and finally crossing a river in a little rowboat. After reaching the other side, our pursuer took us to a small village where the local police chief, apparently tipped off by him, came to arrest us. We were, after all, illegal aliens, lacking valid documents and permits to enter the country. My parents explained our situation and assured him that we would be able to obtain the necessary documents from the Dutch government in London. Besides, if they were thrown in jail, who would take care of their 2 young children? They apparently succeeded in persuading him not to separate the parents from the children. He told them that we could stay in the hotel, but we would have to remain in the village until those documents arrived. Here are a few pictures of us from Saint-Ouen the first picture I have from our journey. Here you see me with my brother and my father. Here, I think I'm playing border guard, having become very aware of borders. Here, a few more pictures. This is the hotel where we had to stay. Here we are with my mother, and here in a nearby farmhouse, probably we went out to get some fresh produce. You may have begun to wonder, how were we able to sustain ourselves all this time, since we had to eat every day and sleep every night in restaurants, boarding houses, or hotels? There were no such things as credit cards, no euros either, and Dutch money would be useless in France, in fact might betray us. Instead, the family lived on the sale of diamonds, which were brought along and smuggled over the borders. My father's father had been a diamond merchant, and even though my father was an engineer, like most people, he knew something about his father's profession. In particular, he knew how to buy and sell diamonds. But the main problem was how to safely carry those little gems with us. For that purpose, he had brought along a pipe with a fat stem. He was an inveterate pipe smoker, and he had followed out the stem so he could stash the diamonds inside while still smoking it. And then he could take some diamonds out and sell them when we needed cash. I only found out about this much later, but I can show you that pipe, which I inherited, about the only artifact I have from that time. It took another 4 months to obtain the necessary documents to allow us to leave France. A time of growing apprehension for my parents. Jews were beginning to be deported even in unoccupied France, and the Germans could decide any moment to occupy the rest of France, which in fact they did only 2 weeks after we managed to get out. A representative in Lyon of the Dutch government in exile was able to provide the family with identity papers which showed us still trying to pass as Protestants. So here's the identity certificate of my mother, and you see Protestant. However, he could not get us a permit to enter Spain unless we had a way to move on from there, because the Spanish government did not want Jewish refugees to stay in their country. At this time, England was not keen on Jewish refugees either. The only territories over which the Dutch government thought they had still some authority were a few small colonies on the other side of the Atlantic. After several months, the government was able to arrange for us and a number of other Dutch refugees to get onto a Spanish ship that was to sail to Suriname on the northeast coast of South America. We finally could cross the Pyrenees into Spain, and after a brief stay in Madrid, we would board the Marqués de Comillas for our Atlantic. Oh, wait a minute, too much. Okay, back onto the show. We boarded the Marqués de Comillas for our crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. However, midway during our crossing, we learned that the governor of Suriname, over which the Dutch government really had little control, he decided he would not admit Jewish refugees, even if they were Dutch citizens. He claimed he was afraid we might become a burden to the community. There might be German spies among us. Other Dutch possessions in the Caribbean, like Curaçao and Aruba, did not want us either. And in those days, countries like the United States, Canada, were certainly not welcome boatloads of Jewish refugees. Finally, the island of Jamaica decided, which was a British colony, agreed to take us in. And if it hadn't been for that, the ship would have had to take us back to Europe, like a few years earlier happened with the St. Louis from Cuba. In Jamaica, we were not given total freedom, but were detained in a refugee camp some distance from Kingston, the capital. The camp consisted of a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences, with rather Spartan accommodations. Bunk beds, wooden flaps for windows, communal bathrooms at the end of the buildings. You could leave during the day, but you had to return at night unless you had obtained a special permit for overnight absence. We could only leave the camp permanently if another country would accept us. Here you see, again, in a family before our quarters, just a glimpse of my mother, but here's my family on the right and some other friends of ours, at least one of whom may be actually watching us. And here we are leaving, passing by a guardhouse through a little shortcut. Here's me in the middle. I did not have such a bad time in the camp, since there were a lot of other children to play with and tropical weather was beautiful every day. But the enforced leisure became frustrating for the adults, and my parents were relieved when they were the first of the refugees who could bid Jamaica farewell. The Caribbean island of Curacao decided to welcome us after all, because my father's engineering skills were needed for work on its harbor. So after approximately a full year after we left Holland, we were able to return to a more or less normal life, and I could resume my schooling. Germany was defeated and the war ended in 1945. A few months later, we were able to return to Holland. But the Holland to which we came back was not a Holland we had left only a few years earlier. Our house in The Hague, while still standing, was reduced to an empty shell with every fixture removed. It could be fixed up, but more tragic news awaited us. After having been uncertain of the fate of my mother's parents all this time, we learned that they had been carried off to Auschwitz in Poland and murdered with poisoned gas. There's a picture of them, and I remember them quite well. Discovering what really had happened, I began to realize what would have been my fate if we had not left in 1942. My grandparents lived only a few blocks from us, and in all likelihood, we would also have been taken to Westerbork later that year, and from there to Auschwitz. A small number of able-bodied adults made it through the war, but children and old people did not stand a chance. Like my grandparents, I would not have survived the year. I understood then that I owed my life to the extraordinary courage and resourcefulness of my parents and their insistence on keeping the family together. At first, my parents tried to resume their pre-war life best they could. I celebrated my bar mitzvah in the old synagogue in the former Jewish quarter of The Hague, which now, due to its dwindling congregation, has been converted to a mosque. Eventually, my folks, like many other surviving Dutch Jews, decided they no longer wanted to live in Holland, with so many people they had cared about missing, and they decided to return to Curacao. After finishing high school there, I came to America to go to college, and eventually decided to stay and become a citizen. In the years following the war, I rarely thought about my escape experience. It happened so long ago during my early childhood, and it had no bearing on my present life. My parents rarely talked about it, and few of my friends were even aware of this part of my past. The Nazi persecution of European Jews was an ugly part of our history, but fortunately it was now behind us. People had learned the horrible consequences of unchecked racial and religious hatred. They vowed, never again. But in recent years, I began to realize it was happening again, and again, and again, and again. Rwanda, Bosnia, Sudan, Myanmar, and now the virus of anti-Semitism and other ethnic hatreds has begun to spread even in Western Europe and the United States. Think of the latest manifestation, harassing and spitting on Asian Americans because of the COVID-19 outbreak. I decided that as a member of the last surviving generation to witness the Holocaust, I must out myself and tell my story. What I experienced is being experienced right now, often in a much worse way, by thousands and thousands who are desperately fleeing from the horrors of war, persecution, and starvation, and who are searching for a place where they can go and rebuild their lives. We may think of them as different from us. They come from faraway places, speak with strange accents, dress oddly, and don't look like we do. But that's only a very thin skin. Under that skin, they are no different from us, those Syrians trying to make their way across Europe and Central Americans walking for thousands of miles carrying their children on their backs. They are us. We must remember what happened to the Jews of Europe 75 years ago and open our doors and hearts to these desperate refugees. And we must never stop fighting that virus of hate whenever and wherever it arises. Thank you for listening to me. I'll now be happy to answer a few questions. And if after the end of this presentation, you still have additional questions or want to contact me, you can do that via the Holocaust Speakers Bureau with their website you see still on the screen. Okay. Question time. Lana?
I chatted you the question.
There was one question here. What do you say to Holocaust deniers? Well, the evidence is so enormous, so huge. They have not a leg to stand on. I know what happened to my family, to many others. What can one say? Any further questions? And if not, I want to thank you again. Oh, wait a minute, there's one question here. How big was the boat that brought you across the Atlantic, and was it mostly containing Jews? I believe that except for the crew, it was only containing Jews. There were about a little under 200 Jews on there. It was actually a very nice boat that before the war had taken tourists to Cuba, Havana, and New York. And after the war, again, it was put back into the tourist service. It doesn't exist anymore. You can still find some information on it online. Were your parents able to escape when so many others were not? Did they have to bribe a lot of people? I don't think they actually bribed people. They did get help from the underground. They paid the person who passed us across the demarcation line, which maybe was a kind of bribe. But I suppose anything that would save your life is okay. Next question is, did your family remain in Curacao? They did not. They stayed there for a number of years. They then actually moved to Caracas, Venezuela. They stayed there a few more years. In the meantime, both my brother and I had come to the States, to America, and it did not look like we were about to come back to them. So they decided to come back to us. They moved to the United States. My father actually got a job in Miami working on the docking facility for the cruise lines in Miami. They have passed away in the 80s and 90s. And my brother passed away a few years ago. Now, another question here. Thank you for sharing your story. How do you suggest that we present such traumatic experiences to younger generations so they can learn and make sure this does not happen again, but is appropriate for their age? That's a very good question. I actually hope I'm part of the solution now. I'm a member of the Holocaust Speakers Bureau, which you've heard us mention. And what we do, there are a number there of survivors and a few also of second generation survivors, meaning their parents were survivors, or even third generation. And we go out to schools in the community and we talk to the kids. I have been just until everything broke down. I spoke at around 6 schools in the Durham area. And of course, I adapted my talk to children. These are middle schools, so they were somewhat mature, and actually they were a wonderful audience. They asked great questions. And so that's one of the things I think we can do as survivors. But in general, education of the young people, I think, is very important. And we're not just talking about the Jewish experience, but the experience of all those groups that were persecuted and continue to be persecuted. And now here we have a question about, did I grow up with much religion? I have to say, not really. My family was very assimilated. My parents did go to high holidays. When I was very young, I was not even aware when the war broke out. And my parents had to explain to me that I was Jewish and that the Germans hated Jews. And I said, well, why do they hate it? And they said, well, they didn't know, they didn't really understand. And I still don't understand. Did I know anyone who wasn't as lucky as your family? Yes, I knew after the war some Holocaust survivors who returned from the camp, who had numbers tattooed on their arms, even a young woman at my school. Some of them really had awful experiences, some of which I didn't know at the time. I learned about much later, the kind of thing they had to actually do to survive, which I will not mention here. Do you think Jews are safe in America today? How do you think we would know if we needed to leave? I do think, in terms of this, I think we are pretty safe, safer than a lot of people, maybe safer than Muslims. In some ways, Jews are never safe. But I don't feel there's an imminent danger. I think we need to remain alert. What happened with the house of your grandparents after the war? Well, the house is still there. I don't really know. I imagine perhaps their children inherited it. I don't actually know what happened to it, but I know it was still standing. I went to look at it not long ago and remember it because I remember it well inside. We used to, since they lived so close, we visited there quite often. I think that's the last question I will be receiving. So again, thank you for your attention and remember the lessons we're trying to teach you here.
Thank you, Lex, for sharing your brave story of escape and the search for finding a safe haven. It's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Long, co-founder of the Holocaust Speakers Bureau and a dear friend. Debbie will announce the winners of our poster competition.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you, Lex, for sharing your poignant story and the lessons that you've learned and want to pass on to the next generation. This year's poster and essay theme was Courage, Compassion, and Hope, Lessons from the Holocaust. This poster competition was open to all North Carolina middle and high school students. The goal of this annual contest is to encourage students to think about acts of courage, compassion, and hope performed during and after the Holocaust. Whether these acts were done by the victims themselves or others who chose to be upstanders, they were prevalent and surprisingly numerous despite extreme danger and risk. We want to thank all of the students who participated in this year's contest, as well as the teachers who supported this program. The decision to choose from the many submissions was a difficult one for the judges. The entries were thoughtful and sensitive. We would also like to thank educators who provide time in their classes to discuss the Holocaust. It is a complex subject to teach, and only the most dedicated teachers would make the effort. We look forward to the passage of the Holocaust Education Bill in the near future. Bipartisan support in the North Carolina legislature for the bill has been unanimous. Once enacted, this bill would require the study of the Holocaust and genocide in North Carolina middle schools and high schools. And now I'd like to show you the 4 poster award recipients and give you a few moments to enjoy the lovely and thoughtful artwork. The first place for our high school recipient was Olivia Todd, whose drawing and essay were themed Connect the Stars. Olivia attends Wake Forest High School in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and her teacher is Bettina Pope. The second place high school recipient is Amarina Chapman. Her work was themed A New Day. She is a student at Alexander Central High School in Taylorsville, North Carolina. Her teacher is Josh Hardis. The first place recipient from the middle school category is Suin Kapa. The theme of her essay and artwork is Piecing Together. She's a student at Lakewood Montessori Middle School in Durham, North Carolina, and her teacher is Christy Brooks. The second place middle school recipient is Audrey Scott. Her artwork and essay were themed Behind Closed Doors. Audrey is a student at Lakewood Montessori School in Durham, North Carolina. Her teacher is Christy Brooks. If you would like to take a look at this artwork at your leisure, please go to holocaustspeakersbureau.org. You will find these same posters on our website. And now I would like to turn the podium over to Rabbi Daniel Graber of Bethel Synagogue of Durham.
Chevra, thanks to everyone for being here today. It's heartening to see this Zoom call fully subscribed, and I want to say thank you to Lex for sharing his story, and thank you to all of and congratulations to all of the students who submitted their posters. I feel saddened that Bethel Synagogue could not physically host the ceremony this year, but grateful to be and honored to be asked to lead us in the recitation of El Male Rachamim, a prayer in memory of all those who died in the Shoah, and then over this Zoom setting to recite the Mourner's Kaddish in their memory. El Male Rachamim, Shochem Ba'amnomi, Hamitzeh Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר כי המזהירים, לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל, שנטבחו והשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם בגן עדן, והיא מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים, אז תראה בסתר כנפיך לעולמי, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני ונחלתם, וינוח בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן. Exalted God of compassion, we ask that you grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the souls of our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel who were slaughtered, suffocated, burned to ashes. May their memory endure. May their memory inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. And may their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. I invite you to join with me wherever you are in the words of the Mourner's Kaddish. And Lana, if it's okay, we think we can take it off of mute so that everybody can respond to the words of the Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shmei Rabbah, v'yoma tivra v'yeh v'yamlich ma'aseh, v'chayecho kon v'yeh d'chol Beit Yisrael, v'hagalah v'zman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach Leolam L'Omed Maya Yitbarach V'Yishtabach V'Yitbar V'Yitramam V'Yitadar V'Yitaleh V'Yitalal Shmei Barichu Ve'ela Min Kol Birchata V'Shirata V'Ushbechata V'Nechamata Da'amiran Be'alma V'Yimru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya Chaim Aleinu V'Al Yisrael Amen. Seh Shalom B'Mromav Ya'aseh Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Al Shvei Tevel B'Imru.
Thank you, Rabbi Graver.
Thank you.
Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, former chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the and current member of the House of Lords, has written, "We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. We know that while we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that while we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure that their memories live on and that their deaths were not in vain. On this Yom HaShoah, we commit ourselves to a simple act to remember, Yizkor. May the souls of the victims be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Rabbi Sachs's words are so important. I hope we will indeed remember the history of the Shoah and the millions of innocent victims we mourn today. I also hope we internalize the lessons of the Holocaust and be moved to action so that tomorrow will be better than the past and better than today. Let us speak up against hate and rectify injustice. As it is said in Leviticus, do not stand idly by while your neighbor's blood is shed. May we see each other next year in person to commemorate Yom HaShoah. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe and healthy.